So what we'll do is just come back to Visual Studio, and in the trigger continue player dialog, we'll check if the player index is greater than or equal to player dialog sentences.length, and we'll say -1 as we're referring to the last index in the array. Although we're saying greater than or equal to, it shouldn't really be greater than, as we're only incrementing it by 1 each time. We'll just say greater than just to cover all cases. So what we want to do is, if we are already on the last sentence, we want to say is we just want to actually clear the NPC dialog text. I know that's odd, but it's because we're calling this function from the NPC button. So we're going to say NPC text.text is equal to string.empty. I'm going to say NPC speech bubble animator dot set trigger, and that's going to be close. So if it's the last sentence, we'll clear the NPC dialog string, and then we will close the animator. And else, if it's not the last sentence, what we'll do is we'll just start the coroutine. So, boom. So that will handle that. So what we need to do is do the same for the NPC. As this is called when we actually click the button. So what I actually want to do is just move the script that controls the buttons out of these functions. So what we'll do is we'll say NPC continue button, and that is called when we trigger the next player dialog, and then we'll get the player continue button and just move that to the trigger and continue NPC dialog. Cool. So we've almost completed this script. So if we just test it, you see that it's all working. Jeez. Yeah, look at that. Yeah, dialogue, speech bubbles working. The only thing that isn't working yet is that we can't press enter, and they don't make and there's no audio. So what we'll do is we'll just get the enter button working, which is relatively quite simple to do. So we're trying to make use of the update loop. So we'll say private void update. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to check to see that if the continue buttons are active. So we'll say if the player continue button, wherever you are, dot active self, and you can either use active in hierarchy, but then it checks all objects in the hierarchy to see whether it's active. If you use active self, it just checks to see whether that object is active, so it's faster. So we'll use active self, and if it is active, then we'll say when the player presses the enter key, we'll just call the same function as the button does. So we'll say if input dot get key down, and we'll use key code dot return, and that is for the enter button. So if the player button is active and the player presses return, we will trigger the NPC dialog. And then if the NPC continue button dot active self is active, and we say if input dot again, then what we'll do is we'll trigger the continue player dialog. So that is the code that handles the enter button, being able to press the enter button. So you'll only be able to press the enter button to continue the dialog when the actual button is active on the screen. Awesome. So the last thing we need to do is just add some audio to the buttons. So realistically, I would create a single object for all of my UI audio and just have it on a simple object called like UI audio. But for this tutorial, I'm just going to add the audio source to the dialog manager. I've actually already got one on, but all I've done is just gone to add component audio source. So once you've got your audio source added, you just need to just fill in the audio clip. And as I've already got an audio clip that I would like to use, I would just select it. So mine would be UI pop. And that's just simply so with the audio source on the dialog manager, what we'll do is we'll come into the dialog manager, and what we'll do is we'll create one more reference. So just create one more reference for the audio source. So serialized field, private audio source, and we'll call that UI audio source. And just to keep with the current formatting, we'll add a header and just call that UI audio source. Cool. So when we click the button is when we're going to want to play the sound. So we'll just, in the trigger continue player dialog or trigger continue NPC dialog, we'll just say UI audio source dot play. Let's just copy that across for the player. So what you want to do is just make sure that your audio source is not set on loop and is not set on play and awake. So now when he's doing, obviously with the dialog manager, is we'll just need to just drag and drop the dialog manager in so it can just reference its own audio source. You can also just grab it from here and chuck it on. But when we press play, you'll now see that when we hit continue, there's a sound, and we can also use the enter button. The last thing you might want to do is just parent the speech bubbles to the actual player and to the NPC, so that this way they're actually displayed with the player and the NPC. Cool. The only issue is that, as you can see, I can still move around when it's talking, and we also might want to trigger this by actually walking up to the NPC. So I'm just going to show you guys how to handle all that. So what you're going to want to do is come over to your movement script. This is a really simple movement script. Obviously you'll be using yours, so it'll be called like player movement script or whatever. So just going to create on pirate ball. Just call this interacting. If we're not interacting, then we will execute this logic. But if we are interacting, then we won't. And then what we want to do is just create a function just so that we can toggle this interaction. So we'll say public void toggle interaction. Now with this method, we just want to say interacting equals not interacting. So that will set it to whatever it's not at the time. So if it's false, it will set it to true. And if it's true, it will set it to false. What we'll do is we'll just come back to the dialog manager. So what we'll do is actually come over here and we'll create a private reference for this. So for me, my movement script is called simple movement script, but you would obviously just put in your movement script here, whether it's player movement script or player character control or whatever. So I'll just call it player movement script. A bit confusing, but as that's what it would represent. And then to assign the player movement script, we'll come over to the start and we'll say player movement script is equal to, and we're going to use a function called find object of type, which just returns an object of a type, and the type we'll pass in will be simple movement script. So you would pass in your movement script, player movement script or whatever. As there's only one simple movement script in the scene which is attached to the player, we could just use find object of type to get this reference. Then when we actually start the dialog, you want to say player movement script dot toggle interaction, and then we'll just copy that. So we'll just come down to where we actually end the dialogue in the trigger continue player dialogue method. And obviously as we close, as there's no more sentences and we close the last speech bubble, we will toggle the interaction once more and do the same for the NPC. Awesome. There's an extra line of code which is within the continue NPC dialogue and the continue player dialogue, which will be this player dialogue text.text equals string.empty. You can actually get rid of that as it is emptied above, just here. So we can do is get rid of this one as well, the NPC dialog text, as it's done, handled up here. And thinking about it, as we actually check for the last, whether we're on the last element of the array here, we could actually probably get rid of the check here. So what we'll do is we'll just get rid of that, and we can right click unindent, and we can come up to continue player button, get rid of this check here, and we can unindent by pressing command or control and then the left bracket. Cool. So if we just save that, it should all work perfectly. So now when we test it, you see that when the player is talking, I cannot no longer control the player, and when we finish, the player should be able to move around again. Yeah, cool, that's working fine. Last thing we'll do is set it up to work with the trigger. So what we'll do is we'll just go create empty, and I'm just gonna zero that out, and I'm gonna add a box collider Obviously, if your game is 2D, you'd add a box collider 2D. As this is actually in 3D, I'm going to use a box collider. So what I'm going to do is just set that to a trigger. I'm just going to call that trigger game object. And we're going to need a script to actually trigger off the dialogue. So we'll just come over, create C# script, dialogue trigger. Just want to open that up. Need a reference to the dialogue manager. So we'll say serialized field, private dialogue manager. We'll just call that dialogue manager. And what we'll create is a private bool called triggered, just to make sure that this only gets triggered once. Then we want to make use of the on trigger enter method. So we'll say private void on trigger enter. Obviously, if you're using 2D colliders, that would be on trigger enter 2D. So we'll say if other dot compare tag is equal to player. What we want to do is start the dialogue. So what we're going to do is just come back to the dialogue manager, and to actually start the dialogue, we obviously need to call this coroutine start dialogue. But what we'll do is we'll just take this out of start. You just cut that. What we'll do is just create a new public method called public void, and we'll call that trigger start dialogue, just to keep the naming the same. And then in trigger start dialogue, we're just going to call start coroutine start dialogue. Now if we go back to the dialogue trigger, and here we'll say dialogue manager dot trigger start dialogue. Now, just want to make sure this only fires once. So we say if compared to the trigger and we haven't been triggered, then what we're going to do is we're going to call that, and then we're going to say triggered equals true. And that way we only call this method once. So what we do is come back, and then what we're going to do is make sure that you've got your dialogue trigger on your trigger game object, and then you'll need to assign the dialogue manager to the dialogue manager field. Then what you'd want to do is just set up your trigger object. So mine is pretty much fine where it is. I'm going to move it just a tiny bit closer, and make sure that your player is obviously tagged with player. If you don't have that tag, just hit add tag and then type it in and then assign it. So then now when we press play, the dialogue doesn't start off straight away, and then when we hit the trigger, the dialogue starts, and we can't move while it's talking, and everything's working fine. So yeah, that's it for the whole tutorial basically. Thanks. Maybe hit a like and leave a comment if you need any help. Thank you guys for watching. This is my first tutorial, so hopefully I'll start getting better. And once again, hope you found it useful.